Welcome back, everybody. This week's edition of Best Movie Year 1987 is about to kick off. This is the podcast where two movie experts, myself, Simon Foster, and one, Dan Barrett, look at the films of 1987. We decided somehow that it was the year that may or may not be the best movie year ever. And after 100 weeks of this madness, we will have that decision in the can. Each week we rate the movies that we're going to talk about in a kind of way that by the end of the 100 weeks, we will know whether 1987 was in fact the best year ever. I've mentioned his name once. We really should get him into this podcast very quickly because he's much better at this than I am. Dan Barrett, welcome to this week's Best Movie Year podcast.
You actually need to evoke my name 3 times for me to appear.
Ah, Candyman style. Yes, of course. That's
Candyman or Beetlejuice, either way.
Sure, that's all very good. Are we tiptoeing around aspects of this week's? We should confront this up front. We are reviewing or having a look at a film this week which had its US release on January 30, 1987. That little film is called Radio Days, the work of one Woody Allen. Now, straight away, I know there's people who are going to be switching off this podcast, and I do not blame you for doing that. We'll discuss our relationship with Mr. Allen at some point through this podcast, what he meant to us at this point in time. But how do you want to deal with this, Dan Barrett? We should sort of talk about it.
Well, spoiler alert, I was 7 years old when this movie came out, so I'm not sure I had that much of a relationship with Woody Allen or his oeuvre. Yeah, look, we're just going to talk about being a Woody Allen film. It's fine. It's of
it
the
is what
era.
it is.
Let's just talk about what it is. We're here to talk about the movie. We're not here to talk about, public conversation.
The art, not the artist. Sure, I get it. Yep, absolutely right. All right, so anyway, let's kick this thing off. January 30, 1987, Radio Days drops into cinemas and drops very successfully into cinemas. Did pretty well, nearly $15 million at the US box office, or $41 million in 2024 dollars. I say we have a look at the trailer.
Sydney, this is our first date together.
Oh, B, you know how I feel about you.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The landing of hundreds of unidentified spacecraft has now been officially confirmed as a full-scale invasion of the Earth by Martians.
Now, I love old radio stories, and I know a million of them. I've collected them down through the years, like a hobby. Anecdotes and gossip and inside stories about the stars. Plus, I recall so many personal experiences from when I grew up and listened to one show after another. This girl singing used to be a favorite at my house, one of many. Now it's all gone, except for the memories.
Pay more attention to your schoolwork and less to the radio.
You always listen to the radio.
It's different. Our lives are ruined already.
I double dare you to sit over here.
This is Irene Draper
and Roger Daley saying,
if you love me, you'd leave your wife and marry me.
Oh, I can't do that. Our ratings are too high.
Paradise.
Lay that pistol down, babe. Lay that pistol down.
I can keep a secret. I know everything about everybody on Broadway.
But what do?
She sings, Mama.
I don't wanna.
Every time I hear that song, my memory goes back to Leonard. That was our song.
Leonard?
Guess that tune!
Clark Gable was in town this week. And where did he go? To El Morocco.
How come you never take me to the Copacabana or El Morocco?
Take the gas pipe.
There are those who drink champagne at nightclubs and us who listen to them drink champagne on the radio.
I never forgotten any of those people or any of the voices we used to hear on the radio.
Be sure and tune in tomorrow for another adventure of the Masked Avenger when he flies over the city rooftops
and we all hear his cry, "Beware, evildoers, wherever you are!"
Beautiful looking film. We'll be talking more about that in a little time. The plot, I mean, it's basically a series of vignettes, is how you would describe it. Him sort of recalling his childhood. It's a fairly gentle, nostalgic tribute to the glory days of radio and of coming of age during the early days of World War II. I've read one critic who calls it a bit like Fellini's Armour Chord filtered through Neil Simon, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's the story of Joe, a teenage Jewish boy growing up with a house full of relatives in Rockaway Beach, Queens, and it juxtaposes the family life of this young boy with the glitter and glamour of radio in nearby Manhattan. So that's basically the plot. Dan Barrett, pick us up here. What do you want to say about this film?
Look, I mean, where to sort of begin with it? So I think certainly watching this, there's a very sort of old-timey feel about it in two ways. Well, actually in a number of ways. So first of all, you got the fact that you don't really have movies sort of made like this anymore, which is just a series of vignettes. Like that just doesn't really seem to happen in cinema. What I found sort of particularly interesting watching, the vignette-ized sort of approach to this film is Woody Allen a couple of years ago made a TV series for Amazon Prime Video. And I was just thinking about the way that he crafts some pretty interesting stories that last for about 2 or 3 minutes, but for some reason seemed unable to do the same thing, stretching it out over 24 minutes. But anyway, we'll put that aside. But then, of course, you have the old-timey nature of this in that it is a period piece film where he's looking back at this family's relationship with radio. And a lot of the stories that he's thinking back about in terms of his own family, thinking about the way that radio framed those relationships and thinking about radio at the time being a fairly new medium, well, the medium of the moment, but relatively new.
Sure.
And radio for them, even though that they are around Rockaway Beach, they're not that far away from Manhattan, but Manhattan still seems like a lifetime away.
Oh, sure.
It's a world away. But radio is the thing that's able to connect like their world to a bigger world around them. And you see these stories juxtaposed against these stories of people working in radio at the time. And for me, that's probably the element of it that doesn't really quite work as much. I kind of wish that they were thinking more about the way that radio impacts on their lives and we only focused on the family. When it took it away and became a bit too sort of radio focused, I felt it sort of stripped away the heart a little bit from what they're doing here.
I found it really interesting, yes, from sort of a perspective of showing a family life, a smushed together family back then, because it's a household full of the mother, the father, the teenage boy, the aunt, the uncle, the grandpa. They're all sort of living this life together in Rockaway Beach, and how the radio became a central point of the household, and how they were able to live their lives I guess you could say through the prism of this little box and be in touch with the world. The sequence with the little girl down the well gave the film a real sort of tender moment exactly when it needed it. I think kind of what you're referring to is a point that I had with the film, which is really my only problem with the film, because I adore this movie. It's framed as a series of recollections from the young boy played by a very young Seth Green. But it dips in and out of the framework of that sort of recollection. There's a beautiful scene between Diane Wiest and Robert Joy where he reveals he's gay, one of the men she's trying to date. There's all that stuff that happens with Mia Farrow and all the characters at in Manhattan as part of the world of radio. They could not be recollections of the young boy. So the voiceover of Woody Allen in this film, which speaks about what it was like to be a young boy growing up in Rockaway Beach at a time when radio ruled the world, is wonderful, but it sort of also doesn't quite hold together as a structure for a film. Having said all that,
I was going to say, usually that's a issue that bothers me, which is that idea of the unreliable narrator who's suddenly telling stories that they wouldn't have really any sort of insight into because they weren't there. But I think that generally this is framed around the idea that a lot of the stories that he's telling are stories that have been told within the family over years. Sure. So what we might be watching here isn't necessarily stories as they actually happen, but really it's him telling the family stories, the lore of that. And so, yes, he wasn't working in the radio industry as well, but I mean, we don't know what Joe's life has been after he grew up and stopped being a 10-year-old boy. It could well be that he's a radio enthusiast and, is maybe part of the industry. He's heard these stories. And so it's sort of part of his own personal narrative as he thinks about his life is just entwined with all these characters and personalities that he's been aware of through the radio that have informed him. And so he's able to tell those stories because, maybe he spent time with people from the radio station the day who've recounted that to him. And so it's part of that lore. It's the tapestry of New York City as told through radio.
I really love that this looks... the central part of these people's lives is the radio. There is still the big, beautiful world of cinema happening out there, and there's a gorgeous sequence where young Joe is taken to Radio City Music Hall to go to the movies there, and it shows what a next step up the movie experience was for as a form of entertainment back in the day. But this is very much a family that lives in a working class neighborhood. Obviously, a strong Jewish community, Jewish faith is all around this film. And that is given real flavor by the way Woody Allen recreates this time and this beautiful period. We should maybe look at where Radio Days came along in the course of Allen back in the day. For me, this is a film that finds the almost perfect sweet spot between his, very melancholy memory films like Purple Rose of Cairo and Zelig, and probably my favorite Woody Allen film from the period, Broadway Danny Rose, and also his sort of family group narratives like Interiors and Hannah and Her Sisters. Because after this was about as good as that kind of filmmaking got for him. He went into a darker, more cynical period after this film with things like Crimes and Misdemeanors and Husbands and Wives. And he returned to this sort of film later on with movies like Bullets Over Broadway, which finally brought Diane Weiss her Oscar, and the Sean Penn one, Sweet and Lowdown. But for me, these sort of thinking back to the good old days sort of movies never got better than Radio Days.
Yeah, I've seen actually very few Woody Allen films over the years, so I certainly don't really have any sort of perspective I can offer on that. But what I can offer in terms of thinking about the idea of presences in this is a stacked cast, and this is...
Oh, yeah.
Look, I'm going to put my cards on the table. I didn't actually really enjoy this movie very much, and I don't think it's a bad movie. I just kind of feel as though this sort of... wistful look back, a nostalgic look back at your childhood. It just kind of feels like I've seen similar approaches since, and there was the impact of it was just kind of muted for me. Like, whether they were necessarily copying Radio Days or if it's really sort of part of a genre, I'm not sure I really sort of have enough perspective to sort of think about where that sort of sits in the greater sort of canon of it all. But I don't know, it just kind of felt like I'd seen these sorts of stories before, but watching a lot of established actors, but also a lot of people that would come to know really quite well in the decade and a half that would follow the release of this film. Like, for me, that was the real novelty. Whether that's just thinking about a very young Seth Green in this, someone who I discovered not too long after this would have been made. Like, my sister and I were onto the Seth Green bandwagon pretty early in his career. I'm not sure what it was about Seth Green, but he just very much appealed to us. But you're seeing people in this, like Danny Aiello pops up for a moment. Jeff Daniels has a very small supporting role in there. I'm just trying to think of some of the smaller roles in here.
Diane it's a real ensemble. It's an ensemble of Woody Allen's.
Wallace Shawn has a small sort of piece.
Tony Roberts from Annie Hall.
I was going to just finish out a few sort of smaller names.
Yep.
Yeah, but also William H. Macy. You've got these people just cropping up for like a line or two, but then they're supporting some of these sort of bigger names through here, like Julie Kavner. Okay, playing the mother in this. Julie Kavner, look, every so often in the film, I just wanted to close my eyes and listen to that Marge Simpson voice coming through. You've got Mia Farrow, which I don't remember. Did those two really work much? Anyway, we'll revisit that again later. Who else? Yeah. Who else in there? Obviously, playing the father as well, which suddenly the actor's name just dropped out of my mind. Michael Tucker. Yeah. And Michael Tucker, I absolutely adore. As you know, Simon, I watched LA Law through a couple of months ago. Sure. And Michael Tucker is just, anytime he's on screen, I was captivated on that guy. I don't know what it is about him, but I just thought he was hilarious in this as the father who refused to tell his son what he did for a job, and it turns out he's a taxi driver. Yeah. Which doesn't bother his son at all, but it's a great source of shame for him.
He gave in the best tip of the day. There's an interesting looking, and I didn't know this until I scanned the IMDb cast list, but the Latin music band leader who's holding the chihuahua during an early song in the film is the Latin music superstar Tito Puente. And the communist neighbor with whom the family has a momentary sort of clash is played by one Larry David, which I didn't know watching the scene.
So you didn't recognize that voice?
No, I didn't, which was really unusual because I absolutely saw William H. Macy, and I saw a couple of other sort of bit players.
Bear in mind, okay, so if you weren't aware it was him until you started reading the credits afterwards, when you actually, the Communist Navy, you don't really see him close up. He's at a pretty big distance, so you're really just going completely off this voice performance, and it's very clearly Larry David.
Yeah, but also the his daughter, the communist neighbor's daughter, is played by the My Sister Sam star Rebecca Schaefer, who those in the know, she was killed only 2 years after this production by an abusive boyfriend. So it's a very sad story. But there are people in the cast of Woody Allen films. It's always worth looking up and down the cast list to see who he gets to come on board for his works, because people certainly back at this point in time wanted to work with him. You mentioned you haven't seen a lot of Woody Allen films. I'm exactly the opposite of that. I grew up with his comedies from the 70s. A Woody Allen movie in the cinema was still a very big deal through the 80s and into the early parts of the 90s. I look up and down this list. Either side of this movie, you've got Broadway Zelig, which I still think is hilarious, Broadway Danny Rose, Purple Rose of Cairo, Hannah and Her Sisters, then Radio Days. And then after Radio Days, into a little bit of a quiet patch with some of his more sort of interior kind of comedies, but then Crimes and Misdemeanors again in 1989. So that's why how his persona and how his public perception over the last decade or so is kind of hard to reconcile with me, because he was such an enormous part of my movie loving and movie watching through this period. And I remember Radio Days very fondly. Got a couple of Academy Award nominations for Best Art Direction in Set Direction, and for Best Writing, an Original Screenplay. I'll tell you what it did not receive. It did not receive a nomination for Best Special Effects, given what an obvious miniature that German U-boat was. Oh boy, that didn't look anything like didn't look anything like a German U-boat.
But isn't that fine though? Like, this whole film is framed very much through his sort of memories of things. Like,
absolutely, yes. I'm being facetious. Yeah, you're right. Sort of, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know. To me, like when I saw that, it just kind of fit like the vibe as to what we were seeing here.
Yeah,
also,
exactly.
Can we just talk about like the visuals for it just for a moment? There were quite a number of shots in this. Are you aware of? I think it started as an Instagram account, but there's certainly a book about this, which is Accidentally Wes Anderson, which is just all these sort of photos in the world, which just kind of look like the shots of Wes Anderson films. Like, there were just a number of shots through this, because this film is a movie that relies really heavily on artifice. Okay, both in terms of the way that things look, as well as a lot of the delivery of the actors, which that was particularly notable around the radio side of the film, more so than the family itself. But the family, there was certainly a bit of artifice at play there. But it just kind of felt like this, it's not too far outside of a Wes Anderson movie, particularly as Wes Anderson's taking his career a bit further in this direction. Like, there's sequences in Asteroid City, which I think have a lot of overlap with the radio sequences from this film.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Great spot. Frankly, I'm surprised that it's taken 5 1987 films to see our first Orion logo. That iconic Orion logo at the start with the circular stars that then becomes the word Orion. That was just everywhere. And I'm keen to see at the end of our 100 movies just how many are Orion titles, because they were such a dominant force in film distribution back in the day.
We're doing 100 movies. I would estimate conservatively it'll be 400 movies that will see it.
I think you're probably right, yes. We touched on this before in discussing the vignette aspect of the film. what we call vignettes, to me, this very much feels like a series of stand-up routines. When I say I was obsessed with Woody Allen comedies, I've got records and I've got tapes of his late 60s, early 70s stand-up routines and things like that. The film opens on essentially a Woody Allen joke where the two robbers are in the house stealing, late at night, and they pick up the phone and it's a Guess That Tune radio show. They win the prize. They clean out the house, and then the very next day, the truck turns up with all the winnings from the Guess That Tune. So the people who've been robbed are actually being, and that's very much a Woody Allen joke. The woman who has a stroke when she sees the interracial kiss, and she dies so quickly she's still holding her cup of tea. The baseball playing amputee, the ventriloquist on the radio. Those are all Woody Allen bits, stand-up bits that have been adapted for his for the screenplay for Radio Days, and I think work really well in that sort of vignette kind of way.
The story about the robbers winning the Guess That Tune, which we should mention as well, the radio presenter hosting that program is Don Pardo, who longtime voice in Saturday Night Live. As well as other things, obviously. That's the kind of story, though, which kind of feels like one of these stories that has been told sort of generation after generation to radio professionals. Okay, it just sort of seems like it feels so naturally one of those industry stories that people would be sort of joking about for years.
Yeah, it does. I was surprised in hindsight, and I should point out I certainly saw this at the movies. I saw this at the Village Cinema City here in Sydney and a couple more times on home video. I had forgotten how much voiceover there is by Woody Allen, that's the whole lot of it contains his voiceover. I was surprised at how little Seth Green was actually in this movie. There's a big section of this film where he's just a background player. The scenes that feature him and his gang of boys, especially the scene where they see the woman getting changed through the window, who turns out to be their relief teacher, and the Jewish National Fund fundraising drive where they start collecting money for the free the state of Palestine, and I use the quote, "You've got to leave some for Palestine." When all he's trying to do is buy a Master Avenger ring. There were some inherently funny little moments in those things, but I was surprised at how little Seth Green there was, as good as he was in this.
Yeah, and look, I think everyone is really quite good in it. It was just, I couldn't get past some of the artifice, which sort of bothered me a little bit. And also there's just a bit of a sameness to this. And I don't think it's the fault of the film. I think it's just literally everything that sort of came afterwards. But as someone visiting this film for the first time, it became a bit more apparent than you, who's probably watching it with the same sort of nostalgic lens.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Woody Allen's telling the story on.
All right. Do you have a most memorable scene, my friend?
Look, there was probably a bunch of notable... it's not so much scenes as much as vignettes, obviously. Mm-hmm. There were a number that I liked. The one that I probably enjoyed the most was there's a story with the aunt who's gone out on a date with, this real sort of schlubby, sort of terrible guy who's done this sort of awful move where, oh no, I've run out of petrol, and it just happens to be near like a makeout sort of spot. Anyway, on the radio comes a Orson Welles style War of the Worlds issue where supposedly aliens are landing, and so he gets out of the car and goes running away, leaving the aunt to walk home the 6 miles, whatever it is, back to the house. Anyway, that just kind of, what I liked about that story was it was kind of funny. Okay, yes. I don't think it landed entirely, but it was funny enough. But just as we're thinking about the way that radio had just an impact in all of their lives, it just kind of seemed like a true radio story that we were sort of familiar with as viewers. And so it kind of just led a bit more credibility, I guess, to the sort of pretense of radio playing such a dominant role in their lives.
Yeah.
The other thing as well I like is it's not so much an entire vignette, but I just kind of like the sequence where Joe's going inside Radio City, Radio City for the first time, and just sort of seeing the majesty of that. And
okay, so we agree.
Well, I thought that was a really important scene, only because it spoke to the fact that radio at the time wasn't just this hermetically sealed media where look, I don't know how much radio you listen to on the regular, Simon, but when was the last time, actually, look, we're bad examples for this one, but your average person, like how often do they ever go into a radio studio and engage with radio professionals as they're making their program? Like it doesn't really happen anymore because radio stations usually in nondescript buildings around the place, and even though they're supposed to reflect the soul of the city that they're broadcasting from, like they just feel so far removed from the city itself, whereas radio at this point really was part of the living, breathing fabric of cities like New York, where you could go out and see a radio show being produced much in the same way now that you can see your favorite murder podcast being presented on stage after you've paid $90 to go and see it. But back then, like it was just part of, you know, your night might be going out seeing a radio show being recorded. Okay, you saw right at the beginning the fancy people hosting the breakfast program, and it's a very sort of lavish production where you see all these professionals around these two people in a very large room that's not great for acoustics, you know, which is kind of important for radio. But, you know, that's kind of the way that radio was produced then. It was kind of part of the living, breathing state of the world and not just a small little studio with microphones and the best possible sound to be produced out of that.
Absolutely well said. Yeah, you've summed that up beautifully. I also agree with you that the most memorable scene visually is when the camera sort of pulls back after Joe and Aunt Bee and her date Chester enter the Radio City Music Hall and reveals just the majesty of Radio City Music Hall at its you know most majestic. That's a gorgeous scene. Visually, obviously, all the great one-liners from the film. I paused the film and laughed out loud when Mia Farrow takes Andre Gregory to the roof and they have sex on the roof. It happens off screen, of course. There's no sex in this movie, but it happens off screen. And her line, "Boy, that was fast," probably helped I had the hiccups. I just still laugh at that. That's one of the funniest.
That was probably the one time actually to get sort of a proper laugh. Very good gag. I thought generally like that entire sequence didn't really do much for me. Like it just, I don't know. I don't think the payoff was very good, but that line certainly worth it.
It was very funny. All right, for me, it's interesting that you call the artifice of it and the look of it as a little bit of a negative. See, for me, the MVP, the most valuable player in this, Santo Loquasto, the production designer, and the DOP, Carlo De Palma. Other than, obviously, Woody Allen and the script that he wrote, the production design of this is beautiful, and the way the camera captures that production design, and it especially captures the Rockaway Beach of the period, that scene right at the start of the film where the camera pulls back on a rain-swept street with the ocean at one end and the tightly packed together houses. I just think is one of the most beautiful things in Allen's films.
To be clear, Simon, when I'm talking about the artifice, I'm not just talking about production design. It was actually more in terms of some of the line deliveries. Like it's a very sort of structured, artificial creation here, and so that's kind of what I bristled at a little bit with it. Generally, I actually don't mind things that are overly stylized in this way, but here it just didn't really quite work for me. The actual production design, though, I've got no problems with that at all. I think it was a pretty handsome looking production.
Did you have a specific MVP as part of the film?
Oh, well, it's Michael Tucker.
Tucker, you love your Tucker.
Big fan of that guy. Really, yeah.
He didn't make enough movies. He didn't do a whole lot other than L.A. Law. To my knowledge, also, you're more a Tucker fan.
I think he also landed on LA Law, made a significant stack of money with both him and his wife, who were colleagues in that. And, you know, since then, he certainly appeared in things over the years, but I'm not sure he really necessarily needed to work in the same way. I think he's also got a lot of stage work in his career as well. So it might be that, you know, certainly through the 80s, during that sort of peak LA Law period, I think he was in a fair bit of demand, but I suspect that he's did a lot of stage work in the years that followed.
You love your Tucker. All right. We're getting to the end of this episode of Best Movie in 1987. Any final thoughts on it? Well, my MVP was the production designer and the DOP. Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
So a one-line wrap-up. Final thoughts on this. For me, it's one of Allen's best. It's got a lightness of touch and a love for character that symbolized his best mid-career work, I guess you could say, around this time. Do I recommend to watch it? Yes. Over to you, Dan Barrett.
Look, I mean, I'd say recommend, not a strong recommendation, but I think that if you're trying to get a sort of fairly complete look at film, if you want to try to fill in some of the things which I believe are film canon, I think this is probably certainly part of that. I think people should watch this both in terms of Woody Allen's film canon, but also just the general film canon. Look, I think it's certainly entertaining. It runs a pretty brisk 90 odd minutes. You know, it's fun. As you mentioned earlier, there's that great hiccups line. There's certainly enough sort of interesting turns of phrase to just keep people interested. Not every vignette works, but for the most part, it's, you know, it's a good entertainment.
Okay, so this is going to be this will be challenging because for me, does it confirm that 1987 was the best movie year ever? Absolutely, it does. But you may be on the fence with this one. What is this going to help the argument or hinder it?
Oh, no, I mean, I like it. I think that if we're considering 1987 as its totality, we want to make sure that each of the films are just doing something interesting where week after week, we want to say that, you know, they're good movies. And this was certainly a good movie. Like, you know, was The Stepfather necessarily one of the greatest films of all time? No, but it was a pretty solid psychological thriller that had some really good performances in it. This is a pretty strong comedy that has really good performances through it and some good little witty witticisms that run through it, like tick, tick, tick.
All right, good to know. That was a snappy little... That was a Woody Allen type of podcast. It was a lean, funny, entertaining, in and out sort of... Actually, we might want to cut all of that. What will be the film next week and how can people find it? Dan Barrett, do you have that information in front of you?
Look, good question. I do have it right in front of me. This is the film that, of most of the films on here, I'm probably a bit more nervous about watching than most.
Okay.
It's a movie called Light of Day, and I'm only nervous about it only because I have no idea about anything to do with this movie other than that Michael J. Fox is in it. And I think it might be a Paul Schrader movie.
It is a Paul Schrader movie. It is the one and maybe only big screen appearance in an acting role by one Joan Jett, who somehow plays Michael J. Fox's sister. But we're going to see how all that falls together in the working class drama Light of Day in next week's Best Movie Year Ever podcast. That was fun, Dan.
Yeah, sure.
Talk to everyone next week.
Folks, we'll see you next week. If people want to find more of us, check out the Screen Watching Podcast. We do weekly reviews of TV shows and movies there. Simon, you run your website there, your little cute site. What's that one called?
Screen-space.net. Screenspace. Lots of things written up there. And you can find the Best Movie Year socials. We're on Facebook, as you mentioned. We're on YouTube and Spotify and all the coolest podcast platforms that are around.
But Simon, more importantly, people should hit up our website. It's called bestmovieyear.com. You can find every time there's a new episode posted, we've got a post up on the site. You can listen to the podcast through the website. There's other pictures and, facts and trivia, whatever Simon's, inclined to post each and every week. But anyway, you can sign up to the newsletter there. It'll arrive in your inbox, so you'll know that there's a new episode of this and also be able to, find details on where you can watch this.
We've
Simon,
got a website.
That's actually probably that's probably the question. Radio Days, where can people see it?
That is very interesting. Now, I wanted to watch this in all its glory, so I had a rental. I rented it from the iTunes store, and it is a beautiful transfer. They've done a good job with it. I don't know if it's available across any of the other maybe free streaming platforms. Do you have any information there?
Nothing seems to be coming up for me immediately, so I think it might be a rental for folks, but it's certainly not a difficult film to find by any means. This has been the Best Movie Year podcast. We'll be back next week as we talk about Light of Day.